when it comes to accessing the Iota. The Iota is locked down, and there is only one way we can access the Iota, and that is through a web browser. So what we're going to do is we're going to HTTPS into port 3000 of the Iota's IP address. So how do we know what IP address the Iota got? Well, there's a couple of ways we can locate the Iota on the network. The way I typically do it is after I connect the Iota up, I will go out to my DHCP server, and I will find the MAC address for the Iota, and I'll find the IP address it received. So now I know what IP address to use. Now, because the Iota uses TCP port 3000, we could scan the network and look for what devices have TCP port 3000 open. What I recommend you do is after you find out which IP address it got on your DHCP server, set up a DHCP reservation. Now that management MAC address won't change. So if you're going to send this out to a remote location, you know what that MAC address is after you've seen it get an IP. Set up a reservation on that remote network. Then when you ship that Iota out and they plug it in, you know what IP address it's going to get. So in that case, we can do that. Now there is a fallback IP address on it, and that fallback address is 169.254.1.1. So if I just took and plugged a cable in between my computer and the Iota, I could use that fallback address to access it, even if I don't have a DHCP server. Now what we're going to find is that after we get that all configured up, we're going to bring up our web browser. We're going to connect to HTTPS, the IP address of the Iota, port 3000, and we're going to get a window that comes up and asks us for a user ID and password. The default user ID and password are admin and admin. Now, once you enter those, the Iota is going to come up and ask you for a new password. So we're going to put that password in, and now we're all set to go to access that Iota. So let's go in, and I'm going to come in here, and we're going to share our Iota, and we're going to start taking a look at some of the different settings on there that we can do. So we've got our Iota connected up. We've set up the management interface. We've got the IP address. So now we're going to come in and log in. Now I've logged into this one before, so I already have changed the address here. I don't want that. All right, so we're going to log into our Iota. Now, the first thing that happens here is that we get our home dashboard. Now, before I continue on, what I'm going to do is come over here, and I'm going to plug in a cable into port A of my Iota. Now, I'm going to run this Iota in span mode. We'll go in and take a look at how we set that up. But I've got that connected up to my network so we can collect some traffic on there. So one of the things that I'll do is I'll come in here to my time settings and make sure that my time looks good. I can come in here and configure up my NTP configuration. So I can set my time and date and tie that in with NTP. This is very useful when we're going in and correlating captures that we've done with log files. Come over here to my network configuration. Now, right now, the Iota is set up for DHCP. I could come in here and change that to a static address if I wanted to. I tend to like to use DHCP with a reservation. That way, if I take the Iota somewhere else, I don't have a static address on there. But this is going to depend on how you want to configure the Iota for your environment. I can come in and I can set up what access we're going to have, whether local access, remote access to it. Also, I can configure zero tier. Now, zero tier is a way that I can access the Iota through firewalls. If I go out and configure a zero tier account, I get a network ID. When I put that network ID in here, what the Iota will do is it will reach out and establish a connection with zero tier. For my PC, I establish a connection with zero tier, and I create my own little private WAN network, my own little software-defined network out there where now I can access the Iota even if it's at a remote location where I can't VPN directly into that location. So this is really nice if you're going to be sending your Iota out to a remote site and you want to be able to log into it. As soon as they power it up, it'll go out and connect to 0 tier, and then we can remote into that Iota. Okay. System updates. Here is where we go to update our Iota. So the Iota is constantly going out and checking to see if there's updates. If there are updates, it will show us the current version that we are at, and we can come in and we can take a look at which version we have, what version is available. If I was not at the current version, I could come in here and click on Update and update this. It will download the new version, it'll install it, and it will restart. So the update process is really smooth, and it just keeps getting better with each one of the different versions that comes out. So to do a system update, we just need to come out here to our Iota settings, go to System Updates, and click on Update. It's as easy as that. So all these updates are done over the air. Lastly, in here we have System Control and Logs. If for any reason you were to contact the Profitap help desk and get some help, they may ask you to come out here and download the logs if necessary. If you need to do that, this is where those are. So this gets us through how we can go in and make some of the settings. So when we first put the Iota on our network, we can log in, we can assign a static IP address, we can set up our NTP server that we want to synchronize with, and we can check and make sure there's updates. So if you don't have your Iota already, when you do get it, make sure you go out and check for updates and see if there's any out there. All right, so now that I've got my settings done, I'm going to come over here to my capture, and I go to my interface configuration. Now, in my interface configuration, this is where I can configure my capture interfaces. So in this case, right here, I can see that port A is up. The link is up, and here I can change some settings on there. I could change my speed, duplex, etc. Not something that I typically go in and change, but again, if you need to change these parameters for your environment, you can go in and do so. I could come in and take a look at my port status and see, is the port up? What do I see as far as the other end of that status? Capture features. This is where I can turn off and on some of the features are what I'm going to do when I'm capturing. So here I could come in and disable one of the ports. So let's say I didn't want to see any traffic from port B, but it's already connected. I could go in and disable port B so that traffic isn't being written to disk. I could also turn on packet slicing here. And packet slicing allows me to conserve disk space. So if I have packet slicing turned on, what's going to happen is, in this case, I'm only going to capture the first 128 bytes of each packet. So this is nice if all I'm interested in is the flows, but I'm not interested in all the data in the packets. Now keep in mind that if we need that data, it's not being written to disk. We're not going to be able to go back out and get that data. And then lastly, we have our firmware. So when we do a software update, it's good to check our hardware firmware version and compare that with the hardware firmware version that we have right here. So that firmware gets downloaded when we do our update. So if you do an update, come out here and make sure that your firmware is updated as well. We may need to flash that hardware firmware. Now, while we're on this screen, I'm going to jump over here to my 10 gig Iota. We're going to go to that same screen. I just want to show you on the 10 gig Iota a couple of the differences here. And that is, one of the things that's the same, and I hadn't touched on this yet, is our span mode. I keep talking about span mode or inline mode. Inline mode will pass packets from port A to port B and from port B to port A. It's designed to be put in line with the device. Span mode captures on A and captures on B and writes both of them to the drive. So if this box is checked, we're going to take everything that comes in on A and everything that comes in on B and write it to disk, but we won't pass any packets between the two. If this is unchecked, it is in inline mode, and we will pass packets between those, and that's designed to be put in between a device and the rest of the network. Okay. Now, on the 10 gig model, there's an important little checkbox or drop-down box right here, and that's our firmware mode. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about the overview of this, that the 10 gig model supports both 10 gig and 1 gig SFPs. But if we're going to use it with 1 gig, we need to make sure we come into port control and select the 1 gig firmware. If we're going to use it with 10 gig, we need to come in and select the 10 gig firmware. So this determines what speed that port's going to be running at. So just because we plugged it in and it auto-detected that there was a 1 gig SFP in there doesn't mean it's going to work with that SFP until we set it to the correct speed. So the firmware here needs to match the speed of the SFP that you put in. Now, many of our capture features look the same here. We do get our SFP information. We do have our firmware information right here. So I can come down. Actually, I see I need to upgrade my firmware. So in this case, I could select that and say flash firmware. There we go. So now I've gone in, I'm updating that firmware in there. So it's going to update that. Well, that's updating. Let's come over here and take a look at our filters. And this is one of the big differences between the 10 gig and the 1 gig Iota models. And that is we can do capture filters with the 10 gig model. So I can come in and check what it is I want to capture. Now, I mentioned before, the 10 gig will capture up to 3.2 gigabits per second, or 5 million packets per second. So in this case, we may want to filter out some of the traffic that we see. And by filtering this traffic out, we can reduce the data rate that's actually getting to the disk, and we're able to write that and not lose any packets. So using the filters in here is a really good way to go in and do that.